I'll just get to this. The headline findings of the project, what we think is the housing design quality conundrum, the aims and objectives, the methodology we used, a brief look at the case studies, and I'll dwell on the sort of significant findings and recommendations before concluding and us moving on to the Q&A. It's not moving forward. There we go. So the headline findings of the report, we start by saying really that we felt that the design quality of new homes and neighbourhoods remains stubbornly low. This is a finding that mirrors a finding by the Place Alliance in their housing design audit of England, which they did back at the beginning of the year, and also sort of chimes with research done further in the past too. We see the responsibility for delivering design value as something that's shared, and that was really a key finding. This is not the fault entirely of planning officers and local authorities, and nor is it entirely the fault of housing developers and their consultants. There's sort of a collective responsibility for the challenges that are being faced with different or less emphases. We found that there were different policy emphases across the 4 nations that we looked at in terms of planning policy and design, but we didn't really find any better or worse outcomes coming through the system when places ultimately got built, with some exceptions, of course. And some of the barriers to design value that we found were wide-ranging. They encompass the ways in which the 4 governments across the UK plan for new housing, particularly the emphasis on housing targets, the extent to which local authorities foreground design that is an issue of concern, and the barriers to that, and so forth, plus a culture perhaps of deprioritizing design in the house building industry, again for various reasons, and also some exceptions to that rule, of course. So this is our team, everyone involved in putting the report together. As Sadie said, I wrote the report up and sort of did the analysis of all the different case studies, but I couldn't have done that without Tom, Flora, Chris, Gareth, and Bilger. Tom in particular really led on the methodology of the report when he was at the RTPI. He's now moved on to a different role, developed it and then coordinated our method. Flora, Chris, Gareth and Bilger all took forward a case study of their own in each of the respective parts of the UK and analysed that data and then fed it back to me so we could write it up. So this was very much a team effort, and I thank everyone else for all their help in putting it together. So what's this housing design quality conundrum then that we talk about? Well, we know from evidence, from practice evidence and also from academic evidence that well-designed places have an enduring sense of place, are characterized by diversity in form, in function, in community. And the evidence shows us that good quality design has positive impacts. It has social value impacts, can improve health and well-being. It has economic impacts. It can improve local economies. It can also raise the value of homeowners' homes. It obviously can have positive and negative effects across the system, but it also has environmental value too. More sustainable places tend to be better connected, with more mixed uses, more ability to do things within the local neighbourhood, and that can then have a knock-on effect for health and well-being and economic value as well. We see devolution leading to a quite diverse design policy landscape over the past 20 years now, but nevertheless all 4 governments do share the view that good design can deliver economic, social and environmental value. They put that in their national planning statements, as I'm sure everyone here is aware. But despite this shared awareness, and really this is the conundrum, we don't do much of the stuff that's shown on the right hand of this screen, a development there by Barratt Homes at Canehill Park in South London. The quality of new build housing as a rule remains poor, and the value of design is often underappreciated. And in a frustrated sense, actually, I think, often a lot of the people involved on both sides of this coin want things to be better designed, but there are barriers that stop it from happening. And we call this the housing design quality conundrum. The report itself builds off a few years worth of work. We've been working on this report over the last year, but before that, some members of the team, led by Bilger Serin at the Housing Evidence Centre, put together an evidence review, a systematic review of policy, grey literature, or policy focusing literature and academic scholarly work around the nature of design value and its role in creating, you know, well-designed communities and neighborhoods. It defined design value and reported that it is typically framed through the lens of the triple bottom line of sustainability, which is why we've referred to the social, economic and environmental value of place on the previous slides. Value we define is typically understood as the measurable worth of something, so it's a generic definition, and design value combines all of the values that are derived from a place, whether they're financial or more socially and culturally grounded. So that was our foundation. The research itself, we thought it was, we hope it's unique in a way in that it purposely aims to look at design outcomes in all 4 nations of the UK. We've seen some excellent work, particularly in England, where there's perhaps a bit more resource to get some of this stuff done, and had some data from that, but we haven't seen a picture of the whole UK and some comparisons. So we had a case study in each place. Our aim was to investigate the extent to which design is valued, with a particular focus on the whole series of stages that occur throughout the development process, right from national policy making and land assembly, all the way through planning permission, but also to include development on site and post-evaluation, not post-evacuation, that wouldn't be good. We have a series of objectives that was focused on really developing an understanding of the cultural conditions and expertise that are needed to deliver design value, and then identifying the critical points in the planning, design and development process where a commitment to design, can lead to higher quality outcomes. So it's UK-wide, 1 local authority in Scotland, 1 in Wales, 1 in Northern Ireland. And in England, we examined 2 local authorities, 1 in the south and 1 in the north, to reflect the population difference, but also the difference in the north and south housing market. We did 48 semi-structured interviews with 54 participants, more participants because some of them sat down together to give us an interview. We did documents and archival research, and we went and looked at all the sites as well and analysed them on the ground. As I said, 5 members of the team did this, passed it to me, and then I have spent the last few months writing it up. Now, we selected these local authorities by trying to find the local authority that had the sort of median or average number of houses delivered over through the last 3 or 4 years. And then we added a bit of extra data to that around political control, average house prices, etc., to find really case studies where we could look at everyday housing development. So this isn't a study of best practices necessarily. We haven't sought out places that have had a unique or really good experience. We've really sought to look at average places where things are just day to day. And we did that then with the 5 local authorities established. We then looked at 2 housing developments in each of those places, using a kind of set of criteria, again, around sort of the average number of houses delivered in the local authority. We sought advice too from local planning officers who gave up their time to sort of help us find what these might be. I don't know if your map's slightly covered by the images of the team, but I'll just thankfully I can remember what they're called. So the housing developments in the south of England were a phase of Great Western Park at Didcot and Sycamore Rise in Thame. Oh, I don't actually have to say that. Is it Thame or Tame? Anyway, someone can correct me. The north of England in Rotherham, we looked at 2 developments within the Waverley New Community, which is a master plan development on the edge of Rotherham near Sheffield. In Scotland, we looked at East Lothian Council. In fact, the median housing delivery local authority in Scotland was Highland, which didn't really fit with being able to work that with the other case studies. But we looked at 2 in a housing delivery area of East Lothian near Haddington. In Northern Ireland, where the volume house builders don't really operate, we looked at 2 slightly different schemes. A scheme delivered a Peter Pan complex by a housing association and a high density sort of flatted development called Portland 88 in central Belfast. And then in Wales, our focus was in Bridgend, where we looked at Park Derwin, which is a master plan development, and a school site also in Bridgend. So those are the sites we looked at. Here they are. I'm not going to talk about them and go through their design, but just to show you a sense that they're average everyday types of development that you'll all be familiar with on edge of settlement or brownfield sites. And they kind of represent the type of development we commonly see in the UK. perhaps the exception being this example here, Sky House in Rotherham, which was a bespoke scheme by a local developer with a local architect, but on the same master plan site as the image here on the right hand side, which was a volume house builder's design. And then the same there in the Welsh schemes, and the two in Northern Ireland, which I mentioned, are just a slightly different, but still part of the housing delivery system. So to understand these, we put together this diagram. We sort of used the metaphor of a river, which I think kind of works, to show the sort of upstream, midstream and downstream moments in the housing delivery system, and the sort of critical points of intervention. National policy, local plan making and development viability upstream in the process happening at the same time. And then we move down into the sort of key moment being the pre-application discussion, which is the beginning of the midstream part of the diagram, where we might engage with local people, start thinking about what the outline planning permission application might look like, and whether there'll be a portion of site master planning. And then really the outline being a key moment for design value, where lots of big decisions are made that can have a knock-on effect further downstream through the planning obligations. I appreciate some of these might move slightly left or right. And then into full permission and reserve matters, where actually we found that less major design decisions are made than are made in outline permission, or planning permission in principle, as it's called in Scotland. And then downstream into construction, some of the challenges of value engineering and cost saving occur, and then into post-occupancy evaluation, which, although is in our diagram, is not something we found a huge amount of evidence happening in a systematic way, although it was something that lots of participants were keen to see more of. So from that, we were able to sort of set out a series of barriers to design value, significant barriers. So I'll just go through these for a few minutes. National and local design policy and guidance, our participants found, is frequently overlooked because other policy objectives simply take precedent, whether that's housing delivery targets or other things the local authority feels are important. We find environmental design was surprisingly rarely discussed by our participants, not because people didn't see some of the design principles they were trying to implement being sustainable, but there wasn't a particular focus on environmental sustainability, at least in the case studies that we looked at. We did find evidence and lots of talk from our participants on both sides of the coin, whether they're working in the private or the public sector, that there remains a chronic lack of resourcing and a scarcity of design skills in local authority, and that this ultimately restricts the design governance activities that can occur. And the planning officer quoted on the right sort of lays that out quite clearly. We find that design priorities can still vary quite a bit between different actors within a local authority. And although not from want of trying to get better design outcomes, sometimes the siloed nature of different departments within a local authority can limit the priority of design. And this was something that a lot of actors were aware of, sometimes a bit of a frustration too on both sides of the equation. We found engagement with local communities was often given quite short shrift, not because planners and housing developers didn't want to engage with local communities necessarily, but they often found it quite difficult, tended to use pretty top-down measurements. And so to use the term engagement, perhaps a little, being a bit generous, there was a lot more consultation and a frustration that it was difficult to implement it. Again, the challenges of resourcing to do that. We found that house builders on the whole have a pretty sharp focus on profitability, reflecting the fact that a vast majority of the houses in the UK are built by public limited companies, where they have other important agendas to take care of for their shareholders, and that there was a limited interest in design as a sort of guiding principle, particularly design beyond the housing, the house typology itself. We found that house builders are particularly unprepared to make design investments in areas where land values are lower. And this can have quite a negative knock-on effect in those areas, where it can lead to a kind of culture of low expectations. Or we better give permission to this, otherwise the developer might go elsewhere. Meaning that design, nuances might get lost. Lots of examples of master planning being used, which was a positive thing to see, and other design governance tools, design codes, etc. And we think that those had quite an impact on delivering design value, especially on some of the bigger schemes that were part of a consortium of developers, where the local authority had said, this is something we want to take forward as a master plan. But quite a lot of reliance on the developers themselves to produce some of these documents that weren't of variable quality, but also they're often poorly enforced. The challenges of staff moving on over a 10-15-year period that a master plan might be built out, changes in the market, adjustments, and not having necessarily a point person to ensure that the master plan is delivered as clearly as it can be. Often a lack of scrutiny, particularly at the far end, right down in the downstream part of the process, a lack of scrutiny by local authorities over decisions taken on site after planning permission, where a lot of value engineering can occur. And as I said before, post-occupancy evaluation not always happening, and really could perhaps be something to think about in the future. We characterize this again with a sort of water-based metaphor, and this leaky bucket of design value. This idea that all these things come into the process, they work their way along, and the values of the social, economic, the environmental values sort of get lost along the way and drip out of the bottom of the bucket. So our principal recommendation, we have 12 recommendations, and I'm not going to go over them in detail. They're all in the report, and please do have a look at them when you can. But I'll talk briefly about our principal recommendation. And this is that housing and neighbourhood design principles, in our view, could be regulated by the UK governments in what we're calling design value standards. And we know that this is reflective of some advice and recommendations given by other recent research. The Town and Country Planning Association looked at similar things in its report on health and communities, and also some of the reforms proposed in England and also in Scotland are looking at ways in which standards or design principles of this nature could be put into some form of sort of generic code. We think these could embed the economic, social and environmental value of design, as we've talked about, and really get it into the heart of planning and house building. Perhaps they could mirror the status of building regs or standards, but they shouldn't be the same. They should be simple, concise and readily translatable into local design policies that champion creativity and diversity. We think that they should be relatively limited in scope, allowing local authorities still to be able to use their discretionary power to judge matters of context and fix and locality. We don't think these need to be sort of a massive new invention or a need to reinvent the wheel. We have good and solid examples of how to do this already, and they exist. Building for Life 12, the place standard that's now quite well used up here in Scotland, are examples of that. Alongside this main recommendation are these other 12 recommendations. Not going to dwell on them, I'm just going to highlight two. We think that the standards would work better if there was design governance leadership championed in local authorities and more investment in it, and that actually there just needs to be more money for design governance. And I know that's something everyone always says, and I'm sure lots of people agree with that, and it's difficult to get it. But I think that the call for more financing for design governance needs to be linked to the climate emergency and the role that sustainable placemaking can play in reducing carbon output and its fundamental importance. And I think that's been highlighted too, the importance of local community by the current pandemic and the need to show design as having a really positive role in making changes in that respect. So some final thoughts before the Q&A. We think the house building industry sometimes gets a bit of a free pass on design because of all these other factors that go into the decision-making process. And we should perhaps be a bit more bullish and say, that there's a certain standard we need to reach, because design is something we think should be recognized as a crucial public good. We think that future planning reforms, and there is evidence that this is happening, should put design at their heart, and that the design value standards we propose could be a precept for addressing the climate emergency and helping us emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic with complete and diverse communities, rather than single-use housing estates as the predominant way of delivering new homes. Just to finish then on a word of thanks, First to our project advisory group, which was from all over the sector, and a number of the members of the advisory group gave us some really helpful and detailed comments, both on framing this study and developing it, but also on the final report, which was very long, and I appreciate the time that people took to read it and give us some thoughtful comments on it. We're also very glad to receive funding from the RTPI, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, the Department for Communities in the Northern Irish Government, and the Planning Directorates in the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government. So that's where I'll stop. If you've got any questions about the report that don't get answered during the Q&A, do feel free to give me an email there at james.t.white@glasgow.ac.uk. I'd be happy to answer your questions. And with that, I'll hand over to Sadie Morgan, who will take us through the Q&A. Thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you, James. I think that was a really interesting and succinct explanation of the report. Lots of really rich, I think, outcomes for discussion. We all know that great design really makes a difference to our health, well-being, social and economic outcomes, but why is it so often left behind? And I think one of the interesting things for me is that it's not a kind of blame game necessarily, but it seems that there are so many different factors that it's like the perfect storm that comes together. But I'm a positive person. I think that with the sort of increasing focus on design quality and sustainability, and I think a general move towards understanding that this is important and it's what consumers want, that we will see a move in the right direction. So I'm going to welcome our panelists and throw a few questions out. I can see questions coming in, which is absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much for those who've asked questions. Please keep them coming in. I'm going to firstly introduce Eleanor Warwick. Are you there? You've come. Hurrah, what a great background. Eleanor's Head of Strategic Policy and Research at Clarion Housing Group. She trained as an urban designer and architect, formerly Head of Research at CABE, where she and her team produced targeted research, providing the evidence to shape national policy and embed good design practices within the industry. Thank you so much for that. In 2015, she was awarded a PhD and has since continued creating accessible and influential research. Accessible, I think, is something we all need to focus on when we're talking about research, including for the GLA on the practical implementation of lifetime neighbourhoods. She has been a construction industry assessor for the TSB, EST, and is an academic examiner. So welcome to you, Eleanor. Philip Barnes. Thank you, Philip, for joining us. Group Land and Planning Director at Barratt Homes. Philip joined Barratt in July 2013, having previously been a director at Nathaniel Litchfield and Partners, a leading economics and town planning consultancy, so he knows his stuff. Philip is a fellow of both the Royal Town Planning Institute and the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. We should just say that as a housing provider, Barratt have complied with Building for a Healthy Life principles on every scheme since 2014, and are also joint developer of one of the report case studies. So really interested to perhaps hear your views on that in East Lothian, Scotland. And Mike Biddulph is urban designer at the City of Cardiff Council. He is formerly a senior lecturer in urban design at Cardiff University, where he established the Masters in Urban Design. He has researched and extensively published on urban design and planning, and is interested in the link between theory, design principles, precedent, and practice. Because Mike, I think you've done it all. Welcome to you all. I'm going to lead off with a couple of questions. But please, if you have any particular, I think, responses or feedback to what you've heard from James, it would be great for you just to sort of give us a few reflections, but I shan't ask you to do that immediately. What I wanted to do is sort of pick up on this issue of value, particularly in the light, I think, of the levelling up agenda. How are we going to be delivering good design in low value areas to help level up when James has just gone through a whole lot of reasons why value in many ways is undervalued or underrepresented. So in terms of levelling up, how are we going to improve the quality in areas where you don't necessarily get the outcome of value? I'm going to ask that to Mike and Philip. I don't know if either of one of you want to kick off, or if you don't fancy answering that question, perhaps a few reflections on what you've heard today would be just as wonderful.
I'll kick off.
Thank you, Mike.
Hopefully you can hear me. And thanks for the presentation, James, and for the report. I have to say, when I read it, I nodded all the way through it, and I think that that it sort of throws out a lot of very complex truths about the processes, the process that we work within, and all of the reasons why sometimes good design doesn't emerge, but also some of the times when it actually does emerge. And I think one of the challenges with reading it is really summarizing simple answers to simple questions. There are often lots of reasons why good things don't emerge, and sometimes it's something to do with very specific details when you're working at a coalface, and sometimes it's something to do with national government policy. And I think that all of the people listening here will find sort of elements of truth in it. Going back to the question, I think it's really interesting, because I was thinking, I work in Cardiff, and if I can just focus on Cardiff briefly, we've got some of the most deprived areas in Wales, in Cardiff itself, and also some reasonably good housing markets too. But when I look at our city, and I look particularly, for example, at where good housing is designed across the UK, often it's in the most deprived areas or in low value areas. And so I don't necessarily think that it's the low value that creates the problem all of the time. And it might be, and maybe Phil's in a good place to answer that question. I'm struck by the fact that we can often deliver improved urban design in comparison to what we used to deliver back in the 80s or the 90s, that we get quite a lot of things right now. And maybe in the schemes in Cardiff where I'm working, that's particularly the case. We can get compactness, we can get access to public transport, we can put in cycle routes and make sure that connectivity is there back into the city. We get good GI and SUDs, and we can list off all of the things that we're good at. One of the things, two things strike me importantly. One is slow money in deprived areas. We get lots of housing associations working, and Cardiff Council is now building council housing in Wales, and maybe we have a slightly different context in which they work compared to volume house builders, and they are willing to invest a little bit more upfront in design because they have a long-term interest in the site, maybe beyond a short-term sales return, 30, 40 years, something like that. So that might be one of the reasons why we get good design there. And the big issue, I suppose, from my perspective, which you've already mentioned, and I've heard in the RTPI event this morning, is just investing in placemaking within local authorities. I think if you have people around the table who are able to challenge developers and designers, then that's a very significant role in some respects. And I do sense that I can get better designers in scheme if I challenge the people making applications. And I wonder if just sort of regionalising design services a little bit, not relying on each individual local authority to have that expertise and skill, but possibly a group of local authorities in maybe a deprived area or in an affluent area, doesn't really matter, but having a more regionalised or sub-regionalised service might be possible, so that you can bring in those types of expertise in scenarios like this.
And Philip, as well as answering the value question, I wonder if you would also pick up on that. I mean, do you think that you're challenged enough in terms of the house building industry? Do you think that we give you enough challenge around design, or do you, as perhaps others have said, you get an easier ride in places where they're lucky to have you? Perhaps you could sort of pick up on those two themes, please.
Yeah, I mean, just conscious a lot of questions coming in, so I'll be as quick as I can. Yeah. But on the low value area, a couple of things would be, let's have more land available, and then land prices will go down, and then there'll be less of the project cost given to the landowner and more available for good design. And linked to that, if it is a low demand area, low value area, as a planner, the planner needs to be clear on its priorities. if it's a low land value, you can't have Rolls-Royce infrastructure, top 50% affordable housing, new community facilities, new library, mass high quality public art, top of the range carbon performance, and then find enough left to deliver a really great design scheme. So be clear on what your priorities are right at the outset, because in a low value area, it's harder to make sure you can hit them all. And then the other thing I would say, maybe in low demand areas, these are areas where the council income is less, maybe that's less resources, maybe these are the areas that have greater socioeconomic challenges which require funding. And so maybe those are the areas where the resource issue, which has quite brilliantly been highlighted in the report, is in even sharper focus. I personally don't recognise the term free pass. You know, I got a scheme in East Midlands at the moment, which has an allocated site. It's got an outline planning permission. We took our reserve matters scheme to committee. It was deferred. We took our second reserve matters to committee. It was deferred each time with officer recommendation. We took our third one to committee, and it with an officer recommendation, and it was refused. And this is an area where we need to build houses for local. This is an allocated site. Local people want those houses, and justice delayed is justice denied in this field. So I don't really recognise the free pass issue myself.
Okay, thank you. Ellen, I'd quite like you to pick up on this sort of long-term stewardship point. You know, if you're in there for the long term, do you think that makes a big difference? And those that the most effective ways, I suppose, of, you know, can that long-term stewardship be something that you can replicate or feed through to others?
No, I completely agree, Sadie. You know, Clarion's been around for 100 years, and we're building homes which we're hoping will be around for 100 years, sort of like longer. And I think, you know, this does really fundamentally shape our approach to design, the fact that our vision's going to have to play out over decades. And I think there are probably about 3 or 4 lessons that hopefully we could sort of like share with the house building industry more broadly. And I think the first one, and there was a question I noticed going past about maintenance and this long-term thing, and housing associations are completely obsessed with it. We don't get it right, but there's lots of things like the way that our approach to a circular economy strategy, which isn't just about, you know, the quality of components, it's actually about thinking about places in the round, sort of like real cradle to cradle. And I think that really affects our, you know, that's a natural extension of our design ethos. We're going to be in the community for a long time. It's going to have to work for a long time. But equally, I think, as Mike said about patient investment, that also means that the value is going to play out over a long time. The sort of like the value sort of like for individuals. And I'm thinking of, we have 3 regen sites in Merton, and we're spending 150 billion sort of like trying to remake these sort of like places, and design's going to be absolutely sort of like critical there. In lots of different ways. So again, it's as you're sort of saying, even within South London, we've got sort of like higher value, lower value sites with different potentials. And we've been able to take a very sort of like design-led approach, so that a design-led density means that maybe one of the sites is able to cross-subsidise funding for sort of like all the facilities that we need sort of like in the other one. But, you know, these are going to play out over a very long time. It's going to be 15 years for these to be built out. And so we need to have both a business case, but equally a design approach, which is going to be sort of like robust and flexible over a long time. And so I think all the things we've heard about design codes and standard design typologies and working with different practices, that's exactly what we've done at Merton. But what's really critical is that we're there as Clarion, standing there as champions and holders of both the master plan, the design quality, the standards that we really want to sort of like expect. So I think it's that thing of you need to have somebody who acts as that anchor man, that anchor person for that. And then I think the final one, and this was thinking about the work that you're doing, particularly Sadie, with the Quality of Life Foundation, is is understanding the value of good design to residents and occupants. And I think that's absolutely critical, and that's really part and parcel of what housing associations are about. And we've used the hacked social value for sort of like many years. And the scheme behind me, sort of Barn Barton, is probably the first regen scheme where actually having well-being plans, having something which was a design proxy there at that initial sort of like option appraisal investment. So as long as alongside having net value, you know, NPV and development costs, we had a value which was, what is the design, how is that going to really impact on the long-term lives and the quality of life of our sort of like residents. And I think that meant that design was no longer an intangible. It was something which was actually there. We were setting ourselves targets and measured, and I think that's the sort of thing that I think we should be doing more of as the industry across the board, that really long-term sort of like view, setting measurable things. And that's why to see the reports and to hear about sort of like setting design value standards that actually are really helpful can play out, I think will be really useful.
And a lot of questions we're having through is that what would those design standards look like, and how would they differ from existing local policies? You know, how do we make sure that in a world where there's a standard for absolutely everything, that we're putting something in place that really does allow for flexibility, adaptability, but improves quality. I don't know if others would like. I'll ask Eleanor first, but if others would like to come in and try and answer that.
And again, I think that's a really huge, sort of like challenge that comes through, because even the best loved design codes, think of the Essex Design Code or the London sort of like design guide, they can come a bit repetitive, samey. You know, we know what they're going to be out. So I think there's something very much about local contextualization, and I think that's where existing communities, that's where local communities are really good at coming out and saying, well, you know, as Philip said, what is going to be really important here? What are the aspects which are going to make this place sort of like successful and, you know, allow them to grow and be really particular? So I think there's something about using them as principles. I think there's really understanding that local context, and the best people who should be able to sort of like understand that and know what's needed are the people who are either living there or sort of like the people who are sort of like leading and directing that process all the way through. So
Philip, would you agree with that? They have to be embedded in place, and perhaps in terms of the sort of devolution conversation, that actually much more kind of local focused, sort of almost the vernacular of a standard.
Yeah, I mean, I feel quite optimistic about the future of housing design in this country, with the emphasis on it and the importance of policy, the National Design Code, Local Design Code, what the white paper is saying about design. And also, Barrett, we've chosen Building for Life 12, which is now Building for a Healthy Life, to be the yardstick we use on every site. And I want to come back, I'll probably come back to this later, at land acquisition stage, at land bid stage, which is way further upstream than James's furthest point upstream, you know, I have to say, as a house builder. So, and I know David Birkbeck, I think, has dialed into this call, but the work he's done for that Built for Life, the organisation designed for homes, has been a phenomenal help to Barrett and will continue to be. And we very much hope that the principles there run into the design code, because I totally agree with Eleanor. What we don't want is 15 different design codes and nobody knows which one to use. Building for Healthy Life for us is fantastic. It's there. Let's everyone get behind it.
Great, thank you. Mike, would you like to add to that before I move on to another question?
Only, I suppose, to ask the question, which I don't have an answer to really, is whether the idea of standards is really going to solve the problem that we have. I mean, I suppose maybe thinking about how designers or architects might respond to that. There are certain areas of practice which we have where we apply a standard, which in my head is quite a strict idea. It's something which you either hit or you don't hit, and it's often quite quantified. I tend to prefer the language of principles and linking back to a sort of social or economic objective or environmental objective. I certainly think those principles should be site specific, and aligned to the principles of urban design, which we've all seen listed in many documents, or they should come from, you know, work done on the site with the community who may have particular goals. I sometimes get lost in the language of the debates at the moment. Everybody's talking about codes. Are they talking about guidance? You know, it's difficult.
So I'm going to, I think it is difficult. And I think when you, a lot of the conversation that's coming through the chat is about actually not just thinking about standards at the point of delivery, but you know, what do they look like afterwards? A great question from Bob Green. Should we stop giving out design awards on new builds and only award them after 10 years or more, once we can measure the design outcomes of buildings? And I think that sort of picks up on the maintenance conversations. You know, how do we actually, you know, of course, at every, you know, when asked, having just handed over the keys, are you happy with your new home? 99.9% people say yes, of course they do. You know, how do we evaluate better long term and make sure that we are using the good, the bad examples of people embedded in their communities, using their homes in a, you know, after 5 or 10 years. So this sort of post-occupancy conversation, you know, how do we start to embed that better? And how do we start to embed those lessons learned, if you like, that come from asking those questions? Do we ask them enough? Or are we just asking, at the outset rather than at the end? Mike, I might start with you this time.
It's a really interesting question. One of my bugbears, I suppose, is the fact that we don't ask people themselves, people who live in these houses, what they think about the house and their community. And, you know, we're all guilty of that, I suppose. I'm very mindful of the fact I have quite a top-down view of planning and design quality. And I always like to be very explicit when I talk about the particular issues that are of interest to me. But when we look at the way that public respond to planning applications, often they're talking and writing and thinking about very different things. And I know that when house builders market housing, they often market them from the inside out, and the actual neighbourhood and community, the qualities of that remain relatively quiet. And I would like to know more from, you know, residents, what they feel about their neighbourhoods. My sense is that they might find some of the places that James and his colleagues thought were quite bad, they might say they're quite good and they enjoy living there for a whole variety of reasons. And I think it'd be really interesting to bring that to the surface. And I also think it'd be very interesting to have more of an explicit conversation with those people about their neighbourhoods and how they live there and if they can live there sustainably. So coming at it from both ends would be really interesting.
Yeah, I hate to give a plug for the Quality of Life Foundation, but of course that is exactly what we've been doing in our nationwide research, is actually asking people about their homes and communities and what improves their quality of life. Philip, would you like to just pick up on that sort of asking communities rather than telling?
What I would say is there's no doubt community engagement helps the design of a scheme. In my previous world as a planning consultant, did hundreds of public consultations. I couldn't name one where the design of the scheme wasn't enhanced by some of the feedback we got. A lot of it was very negative and poisonous and wasn't helpful, but you always got something to make it better. But if I was to, I mean, I thought the report was great, but it doesn't talk about the landowners. They are probably the most important people in the design process. You know, our Cane Hill scheme, why does it look great? It's because it's a Homes England scheme and they were obsessed with the quality of design. Why is there only one zero carbon major development in this country, the one we did at Hannam Hall? Because Homes England wanted a zero carbon scheme at Hannam Hall and we priced it accordingly. If the landowner is only interested in maximise, getting their very last ounce of pence from their land, that is a greater design challenge than working with a landowner who's crucially focused on his legacy and her legacy and the quality of the scheme. And linked to that, 87% of planning permissions in England, Barrett Research on our website, are not secured by house builders. They're either secured by the landowner or a land promoter. So James, you're absolutely right on the cruciality of the outline planning permission stage, but what are the drivers of the people involved at that stage?
Can I just add one little point here? We found that coming out a lot. We actually had, and I remember Flora and one of the authors and I discussing this a few months ago, a real challenge finding landowners who wanted to talk to us. So which created them as quite an invisible but powerful force. But we did see also a lot of schemes being developed by land promoters and then going to outline planning permission as sort of setting the ball rolling for them what could happen further down the line. But I think there were certain actors that were invisible that we would have liked to have learned more about, which probably slightly answers your question about, you know, where were the landowners from the conversation.
I mean, as a land and planning, we used to just be focused purely on finding sites. We're now, because of our emphasis on design at Barrow, we're increasingly focused on finding the landowners that share our views and culture on design. Because if it's just a site where there's going to be 20 bids, everyone's got to smash themselves to pieces on minimizing the build cost. You don't have to be a genius to work out how that might affect the downstream design. Whereas if you're working for a landowner who's saying, come to me, I'm going to pick the best design, you gear up and you tool up and you go for that.
And I'd really, jumping in there, I'd really want to sort of like reinforce what Philip's saying. All the examples I was thinking of were housing association, you know, own land sites. You know, they're really sort of like the own sort of like schemes that we have. And I think that sort of like sense of being able to, you know, you only have to think of the biggest risk for housing associations and for social housing coming out of the Planning for the Future white paper is the idea of the infrastructure levy and the changes. You know, Section 106 isn't perfect, but Section 106 is delivering 50% of all the social housing that we have. And I think the fact that we're getting this sort of like unbelievable sort of two-tier system where we have the sites, where we have the commitment, where we have the interest, it is possible to deliver something, and then you know, there's that, well, this is the rest that sort of like happens. And I got the impression from the consultation that, you know, there were concerns about that. You know, even the fact that there was even a question posed in the white paper sort of like consultation about sort of like, you know, delivery of sort of you know, through the new levy, what steps were going to be needed to ensure sort of like quality. And I think Philip's really right. If you can get those things baked in at the very sort of like beginning stage, that's going to at least give design quality a chance to sort of be encouraged to sort of like actually happen.
Oh, classic unmute myself. When it comes to the planning white paper, you know, if you could think of some of the positives that have come out of that rather than dwell on anything else. You know, if I was to ask you, you know, if to exactly those points you've just been made, would you highlight something that you think is really important for us to change?
I think it's something about tying together those very early stage discussions with making sure that the people who have the sense of stewardship of that, and quite often that is the local community, are able to sort of continue to make sure that quality is delivered as sort of like in the long term. And from the research that we know by talking to our residents, and we talk to lots of residents all the time, we know that 2/3 of our residents actually do support development and social housing in particular, sort of like in the areas where they live. So this idea that the quality of design from the planning and the housing is a way of increasing community support for house building, I think is really, really valid. I think the critical thing is who do they trust to build those? And when we've asked our residents, they've said sort of like 67% think Clarion should be the people to be building new homes, which is all right, I guess. But there's something about recognizing that trust to deliver, to actually say, this is what, you know, at the very early stage, the whole point that sort of like Philip was saying, if you can bake that in at the housing allocation stage, you say, this is the standard, this is what we can afford, this is what we're going to be able to deliver here. That degree of certainty, I think, would land really, really well with local communities. So,
Philip, if you were to be handed, you know, rather than the landowners on a platter. No, how would you, you know, we talked earlier about this isn't anybody's fault, but actually it seems to me that you're actually putting a sharp focus onto those who are extracting value, right, you know, trying to extract maximum value very, very early on, and leaving you or those who come you know, early on in the process, you know, very little room to maneuver. What would you, if there was one thing that you could extract either from the white paper or as a sort of leave us with today, what would that be to you think?
I wouldn't necessarily say I'm being critical of landowners and land promoters. They have a job to do, and they have their own aspirations. And let's be honest, there'd be less land on the market if it weren't for landowners and land promoters getting planning permission, especially as house builders probably become more risk averse since the GFC. I just think on the stewardship problem, we just need to be careful we don't revert to a kind of rented good because there's a land loan versus owner occupied bad because it's going to a residence management company and we don't know if we can trust it. You know, we've got 89% of people in this country want to own their own homes. We have to design a policy and a system that allows for that, not just say stewardship's difficult, let's just have everywhere as rented homes. So, you know, I think that the planning white paper is setting, I mean, I'm a supporter of the direction it's going in, to be honest. I share Eleanor's view about infrastructure levy issues, but, you know, it's about design, it's about a clearer, simpler, faster planning system. We want to get behind that and help the government deliver it.
Mike, would that be your take if you were to pick out a positive?
I mean, I was going to focus on a negative. I didn't want to do that.
You're not allowed.
Yeah, sorry. I work in a different governance setting in Wales, so you know, I sort of and I mean, in general, I feel very positive about the governance framework here in Wales. You know, it's interesting to see that the comment about how these places, the countries are compared or the nations are compared. You know, for me, we can do everything that we want to in design quality terms, and you know, I totally agree with the comments about land and sort of landowners and their goals. I think that's really important, and you know, we can do so much more if we have the backing of good landowners, good developers, you know, good everything in relation to what we do. We just struggle with the resourcing of this within local authorities. You know, you do need to have people who push it through the planning system in some respects, just to get development up to adequate or good. And of course you will get those exceptional scenarios where people want to do something exceptional. I can't make people do that in my job. Yeah.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left. I've done a terrible job of keeping you all. There's so many questions. I tried very much to encourage the conversation to sort of pick up on most of the focus, I think, of those questions that came in. Thank you so much to the panel. I would just like to give you 15 seconds each just to give one last thought on the report, which I think is an excellent piece of work. Thank you so much for making that happen. Thank you for being here and participating. So Eleanor, just a sort of last hurrah, if you like, before we close the session.
Fabulous report. And as I say, some of the mixed messages, which were sort of like there about, you know, I think it's always easier to try and sort of like solve problems if you actually have that sort of like clear view of where the challenges are and where the crunch points are, and that's what this report does.
Brilliant. Thank you, Philip.
Yeah, great read, enjoyed it. As I said, two missing elements for me: the role of the landowner, and I didn't see much about popularity. I sometimes worried that what architects and urban designers think is good design doesn't chime with what the general public think is good design. And I'm really pleased to see the white paper putting an emphasis on popular design, not the views of a particular profession or interest group.
Great, thank you. And Mike?
I think it's great. I carry on learning all of the time, and you know, a report like this provides new insight. And what's really interesting is that we're all talking to each other now and sharing our own experiences. It's really valuable to hear from, landowners, developers, architects about their experience of this process. I just want to make the point that I have a long list of great housing schemes across the UK, which I visit on Google Earth all of the time to have a look at, and it's always really interesting to find out why they're good, so that we can replicate that wherever we are in the UK.
Okay, great note to end on. Thank you everybody for participating and joining us today. There is an offer to answer those questions from the team that haven't been answered if you would like them to do so. Not the panelists, don't worry. I can see you. Yeah.
Don't be away. Don't.
Yeah. But anyway, thank you so much, Eleanor, Philip, Mike, James. What a great hour we've had. Really rich discussion, lots of food for thought, and a great report. I would absolutely urge you all to read it. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.